to our Wednesday night class for this week. This is our third class that we've done. Jim Morgan's joining me again, and we've taught on a couple of different topics so far, but this week we wanted to start a series, because we know if we say the word "we're starting a series," that means
everybody will believe it's us.
That's right. And you know it's going to outlast the coronavirus. Doesn't matter how long it goes. But in all seriousness, we thought it'd be great to start a series and kind of give us some traction for the next several weeks, and wanted to start in the most logical place to start, which is the book of Genesis.
Everything goes back to Genesis.
That's right. So we're going to start in Genesis and talk about the story of Joseph. We'll actually talk about this a little bit on Sunday as well, but we wanted to give you some real sense of context and understanding the depth of Joseph's story. And so if you want to turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 37 and follow along with us, that's where we'll be studying today. But I wanted to quickly mention that if you have any questions, we had a few people make some comments via email over this past week, but and that's great too. But if you want to ask any questions or anything, please feel free to email the church office. I'll put the link up at the bottom of your screen. And we'll be happy to read and discuss those questions, either answer them next week on camera or even discuss the question next week. But certainly we'll make sure we get back to you. I wanted to just continue to remind you of that. And let's go ahead and let's dive into the life and the story of Joseph.
Even if the questions are not about the story of Joseph, those of you who have been in our classes know we chase rabbits a lot.
Oh, man.
So just ask the questions, whatever you want to talk about.
That's
we'll
right.
be glad to go there.
Absolutely. So here we are, Genesis 37. This is kind of the beginning of Joseph's story in the text, but truly Joseph's story doesn't start in 37. It really kind of starts earlier on, and we learn the context of his life, what he's born into, this family dynamic that he's born into.
Yeah, it's interesting there in chapter 37 where it says Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. And in the first part of verse 2 says, this is the account of Jacob.
Mm-hmm.
And then it starts what we recognize as the story of Joseph, which means that biblically this is not so much the story of Joseph as it is Joseph's story tied into Jacob.
Mm-hmm.
And we think there's a relevancy here because it's what we know is a good person, and bad things are starting to happen to him. And so that seems to have some relevancy to what's going on in our world today.
Sure. And Joseph's story, all throughout his story, there's a lot of things that are outside his control that happen to him. Mm-hmm. And one thing that has happened to every person listening to this class and to both of us is that we were born into a family and we didn't get to pick which family we got born into. It just kind of happened to us, right?
Yeah.
And so all the frills and all the challenges and all the things that come along with being born into a family, Joseph's a real person, so that happened to him too.
And for most of us, that's where what we are and who we are, that's where it all started. That's where it came from. How many times have people said, you remind me so much of your father or your mother or whatever. And in Joseph's case, that's not necessarily a compliment.
Yeah, there's some challenges early on, even going all the way back almost 6-7 chapters and looking at the dynamics of his home that he was raised in. Joseph's wives, Leah and Rachel. Jacob's wives, Leah and Rachel, and then also their servants, Bilhah and Zilpah, and their children. So it's all kind of these dynamics of who these sons come from. Mm-hmm. And a lot of deception in his family's history, his father and his mother, and his grandfather, his grandfather affected by that situation, his grandmother being kind of deceptive.
It's been a messed up family for a long time. It's like we said before we started, they put the dis back in dysfunctional family.
Yes. And you think about his grandmother on one side deceived his grandfather to get Jacob's birthright, his father's birthright. And on the other side, his grandfather essentially sold his daughters when they talk about their experience. Hey, you treated us as foreigners. He sold us to you when they're talking to Jacob about leaving. And he says, right, would you guys be okay with leaving? And they're like, what kind of dad is he? Of course we'll leave.
Yeah.
He didn't love us,
Nobody in this story gets any votes for Father of the Year.
No. And so this is kind of the context that Joseph is born into. And one of the biggest things I wanted to highlight between Jacob and Esau and between Leah and Rachel is this sense of competition that they have with each other. Outdoing each other in this sense in terms of giving sons between Leah and Rachel and the competing nature of that dynamic.
You have to be better than the rest of the family.
Yeah, and so when we come to Joseph and he's 17, and the text tells us that, man, did his dad love him more than any of the other sons because he was a son given to him in old age. Guess what? That idea of competitiveness among family, that's going to come out in this story between Joseph and his brothers.
Yeah, especially when he has the dreams about, y'all are going to end up bowing down to me.
Yeah, that kind of
sure didn't
takes
help
it up
the situation.
Right. And so we want to be mindful of all that in the household, in Joseph's history, because it's going to affect him as we look in Genesis 37, and really it affects him at large for most of his life. So let's begin in 37 and verse 1. It says, Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings in the land of Canaan, and these are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. And let's remember at this point that there's 12 brothers in all, right? He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. So what is that? Let's talk about what that means in more simple terms. Joseph, the youngest, or the younger, more favored, gets all the special attention and love from dad and brings a bad report about his brothers. What are we talking about?
Tattletale.
Tattletale, right?
Yeah.
And
remember, this is going to come up again because the last thing that happens before he gets sold into slavery is that his father sends him out to check on him.
Yeah, dad's gotten so used to this relationship that they have that he asks him to go out and spy on his brothers and bring back news.
He's his intelligence resource.
Yeah, and any of us that have a younger sibling, you've lived this, so we're not teaching you anything. That's right. Verse 3, Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. Now there's a lot of really important information we're given here in verse 3. Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. That's going to affect the dynamics in the household, especially when it's so obvious that he's giving his son the special gift that he can wear and kind of parade around in, so to speak, in front of his brothers to flaunt the fact that he's favored.
Yeah, and in the story, anytime a coat comes up, it's bad news. Because here, they're going to hate him for it. Later on, that same coat is going to be dipped in blood and used to deceive his father. And then when he gets into Potiphar's household, Potiphar's wife snatches his coat and uses that to accuse him of what she says that he did. So anytime that a robe or a coat shows up in this story, it's bad news.
It's a good point. It's first used to prove he's loved, second used to prove he's dead, and third used to prove he's a criminal.
Yeah.
So I think that's a pretty important point. So he's loved more than any of his sons because he had him in old age. I kind of did the math, and it looks like Jacob was about 91 when he has Joseph.
That's old age.
Yeah, that's old age. And it's kind of interesting because you think about Abraham and Sarah when they had their first child. I mean, that was a big deal because of how old they were. Yeah. Jacob's no spring chicken.
And Isaac and Rebecca.
Absolutely.
It runs in the family.
Yeah. So here's Joseph, the loved son. His dad loves him so much he gives him this robe. And there could be kind of a whole discussion there about what the robe was. But verse 4 says, But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers. This was not a hidden fact that Scripture is revealing to us that Joseph was favored. He's got the coat, and his brothers are all fully aware that he's the beloved son, right? And the text doesn't say, and so they loved him all the more, and they were just so happy for him that dad loved him so much.
Yeah, we're so glad.
The text tells us they hated him, and they could not speak peacefully. They couldn't find a kind word to say to him because of this tension that exists. And again, I think it's important to tie this back to Leah and Rachel seem to have this same relationship with each other. Yeah. They were raised in a house where Leah and Rachel were probably doing the same things, and they get to the point where they're selling time with Jacob to each other. And I think that tells you things have gotten kind of tenuous around the house.
Yeah, one of the most bizarre stories is the one about the mandrake roots. That Reuben finds some, brings them to his mother. Rachel says she wants some of those. And Leah says, well, okay, but I get the husband tonight.
That's right. And,
And a mandrake root, by the way, for those of you who don't know, it's an aphrodisiac. Okay, it supposedly helps with fertility and getting pregnant, which is the whole point of the competition. And sure enough, Leah gets pregnant.
After it said she had ceased bearing children.
Yeah.
So maybe some truth there to that. And I think that brings up a point that's going to tie into our story of Joseph, that Rachel and Leah knew what it was to be sold for a price to Jacob.
Yeah.
Jacob knew what it was to be sold for a price from Rachel to Leah, and Joseph's going to learn what it is to be sold for a price by his brothers.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's an interesting theme that's there here in the text as well, and obviously pointing at some point to Jesus. Jesus knows what it's like to be sold by his own people. So here's this hatred, this angst in the family, and then this is really going to kick this thing up a notch here in verse 5. You want to take the text?
Oh, yeah, we're going on steroids now.
Yeah.
Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. And that's a phrase that's going to keep recurring.
Mm-hmm.
Just when you think they can't hate him anymore, something happens and they do. And we talked about it before. If you're already in a competitive family and you have the kind of a dream that he has, you really don't want to go and tell everybody about it.
Correct.
It says, he said to them, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, and suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. And his brothers said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. And then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Listen, he said, I had another dream. And this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. And when he told his father as well as his brothers, and this probably hadn't happened very often, his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. So if things were bad before, they just tripled.
Mm-hmm.
Even Dad's mad at him now.
Yeah, and these dreams that he's having, you'd almost think it would teach him to stifle his dreams after the response that he gets, right? And but again, it antagonizes more vitriol in the situation.
Yeah. But on the other hand, what got him in trouble here is what's going to get him to power in Egypt.
That's right.
So sometimes it's not so much the action as the context.
Mm-hmm. And if it wasn't for this vision, we might assume it was some kind of coincidence or accidental. What ultimately ends up happening.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like what we see with Jesus in the New Testament, just as he said it would, right? We learn that phrase.
Yeah. And you have to wonder, when Joseph is sitting there in that dungeon, did he ever think about this dream and I wonder what that really meant? Because it sure doesn't look like that it's going over very well. And even when he comes to power, he doesn't think he's ever going to see his brothers again. After all, it's been so many years. Nobody ever came looking for him.
That's right.
How are my brothers going to... That must have meant something else.
And the other interesting thing I find here is Joseph has the visions, but his brothers, his father, are interacting with his interpretation. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the other places we see everyone's completely clueless and tell us, and Joseph has to reveal it. But so this is the context of Joseph's life. He's 17. He's been the favorite son probably for 17 years, especially of Rachel, if not Jacob. He's enjoyed the spotlight. He's enjoyed getting everything he wants. He tattles on his brothers, gets them in trouble, but he has very minimal discipline from his father, maybe not much at all. And this is where he's at when he's 17 years old. All this has led up to his brothers, and I like what you said, it keeps going deeper and deeper. You think the hatred's gone as far as it could possibly go, and it takes one more step. And so this is what's leading up to verse 12, and the first kind of roadblock or disaster or cliff that Joseph's life seems to drop off. Everything's going so well, and then we see what his brothers ultimately will do to him in this story that unfolds starting in verse 12.
Yeah, and remember, we know the end of the story.
Right.
So it's easy for us to read this story and think, boy, he is so lucky. Joseph knows none of this. Mm-hmm. He's about to enter into a period of his life where his age is more than going to double, and it's a completely different kind of life.
That's right. Yeah.
So, it's just as bad to think, well, this is for Sunday school for the little kids. Mm-hmm. This is an adult story.
Yeah.
And it's a story where Joseph doesn't know where this is going, And the only thing that's going to keep him going is somewhere along the line, he rediscovered discovered a faith in God that somehow God's going to make this happen.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the only thing that's going to get him through. And if that's not relevant to what we're going through right now, then I don't know what is.
Yeah, and just to kind of hit on that a little bit more, we typically, when we read scripture and we look at other people's hardships, it always seems like that's when we believe in momentary troubles,
Mm-hmm.
but when it's our life and it's struggles we go through, it's like every day is an eternity.
Yeah.
Joseph is going to see 13 years of hardship before he gets to where we think of like you talk about Sunday school, he's by the side of Pharaoh, he's leading, he's in this great position. I mean, it's going to be 13 years before it gets there, and there's going to be some even more significant struggles that he's going to face between here and there. So we're not talking about a couple days of struggle. We're talking about years of challenge and not knowing and that hardship, those trials that he's going through.
Yeah, and the thing about it is that Joseph not only doesn't know where this is going, but you can't help but think that somewhere he's laying there, he's thinking the first few days, Daddy's going to come get me. Or when he finds out what's going on, these guys are in trouble. He doesn't know that the brothers have taken that coat, dipped it in blood, convinced his father he's dead. All he knows is nobody ever came looking for me. And apparently when he gets to a position of power, he never goes looking for his family either. He's out of it.
They're dead to each other.
Yeah.
It's a good point. Verse 12, now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. And he said to him, here I am. So he's happy to go, right? Here, my Lord, send me. He's kind of like Isaiah, right? So he said,
well, it gives him a chance to tattle.
Yeah, that's right. He's excited. So he said to him, go now and see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields, and the man asked him, what are you seeking? I'm seeking my brothers, he said. Tell me, please, where are they pasturing the flock? And the man said, they have gone away, for I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. So his brothers aren't where they're supposed to be. So the father's suspicions were founded, and Joseph goes to see what they're doing at Dothan, probably to have a little better story to bring back to dad. Not just they're not where they're supposed to be, but here's what they were doing.
Yeah, and it means that he's gone longer than Jacob suspected he would. And so when they bring that robe back, he thinks that's why he never came back home. The animals got him. Because the brothers say, look, we found this. Do you recognize it? And so again, Jacob is deceived. The brothers know what's going on, but they're not going to tell. And Joseph doesn't have a clue what's going on back home.
Absolutely. They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, here comes this dreamer. So they have not forgotten about his dream. That didn't just go away. Verse 20, come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, let us not take his life. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father. So there's several plots that are kind of unfolding here.
Yeah, Reuben's trying to get in on Daddy's good side.
That's right. And there's some...
This is not out of the goodness of his heart.
No. The lesser of two evils, if you will, right? And so there's these plots that are developing among the brothers, but no one's saying let's not do anything at this point.
No.
So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe. Now, again, I think there's a reason why they chose to use that as the implement of his demise, because Jacob would know that Joseph doesn't go anywhere without his coat, and his brothers couldn't have just, taken it from him without his ability to come and tell him.
And when he saw him leave, he knew that's the last thing he saw him wearing.
That's right. So they stripped it off him, a robe of many colors he wore, and they took him and threw him in a pit, and the pit was empty, and there was no water in it.
Okay, can we back up just a little bit?
Yeah.
One thing here, verse 18. This is They saw him in the distance. Before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. I got two brothers, younger brothers. At times I've thought, but I never plotted. But that goes back to the story of Jacob and Esau, because when Jacob, got the inheritance, one of the most chilling passages in the Bible is where his mother tells Jacob, your brother is consoling himself by thinking about how to kill you. So this is kind of a family trait here. They seem to enjoy their homicides.
And the feeling between Esau and Jacob was Jacob didn't deserve it, right? Same feeling here. Joseph doesn't deserve the special love and attention that he's getting. And another aspect of this is he doesn't even share the same mother as them.
No.
So he's not really our brother. I mean, you can think about all these ways they can justify this action that they're about to take against them.
Yeah. By the way, if anybody knows what Joseph would have called Leah, please let us know, because we can't figure it out.
Yeah, we talked about it. We were like, I don't know what he would have referred to her as. Mom number 2. I don't know. Verse 25. Then they sat down to eat, and I think there's a deliberate transition here from 24 to 25. They throw him in a pit that doesn't even have water in it, and what do? They sit down and they're all having dinner together. I mean, that to me is
fellowship
just like,
meal.
Yeah, exactly. He can smell the meat cooking or whatever, and he's down in the pit, doesn't even have water. So that tells you the distress of his situation. He's suffering, right? Even at this point. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him. For he is our brother and our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him.
That's spooky.
Isn't it?
It is. What are we going to gain if we kill him? Let's sell him instead.
Yeah, let's at least get some money out of this thing.
Let's get some money out of this. Interesting. Judah came up with the idea. Judas is another person who's going to do the exact same thing. Let's get some money out of this.
That's right. Let's at least benefit from selling out our brother. And also, let's note that Judah is the one here with this idea.
Yeah.
Reuben is the first one who said, well, let's not kill him. Let's just put him in the pit. And Reuben's kind of secondary plan is maybe to try and bring him back to his dad, to benefit him, to bring him closer to his dad. But Judah's plan is now going to make Reuben's plot untenable, right? Because you can't bring him back if he's gone all the way to Egypt.
Yeah, and that's going to occur down in verse 29 when we get to it in just a minute. But there's plots within plots within plots going here.
But none of them are out of best interest for Joseph.
No, Reuben wants to get in good with daddy, and Judah just wants to get money.
Yeah, and they'll both come back up later on, later on in the story, which is going to be, I think, an important piece of all of this.
Highlight that in your Bibles, and we'll come back to it later.
It's going to be really important later on. Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites, let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. So again, sold for these pieces of silver. And actually, I can remember from some of my classes I took at Harding with Dr. McMillan, and he talked about how we actually have some artifacts from archaeology that we found that list off the price of common slaves at this time, and 20 shekels of silver was a fairly, it's not an exorbitant amount of money. It's like a normal transactional amount for a slave.
Yeah, if you have the NIV down in the footnote, it says that's about 8 ounces of silver.
So my point is, it's not even like they got a lot of money for him.
No.
This is just a normal, any old slave. They didn't even try and say, well, he's our brother, man. Let's get a lot of money for him if we're going to sell him. We don't care. Whatever they'll give us, we'll take.
10 brothers, 20 shekels, 2 shekels apiece.
Yeah, math works out pretty, and I bet they did that math pretty fast too.
Probably so.
When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, the boy is gone, and where shall I go? Then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, this we have found. Please identify whether or not it's your son's robe. And he identified it and said, it is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son for many days. And all his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son, mourning." Thus his father wept for him. This is tragic on so many levels.
Mm-hmm.
They let their father think that his son is dead. They don't even tell him, he came to us, but this animal came and we weren't strong enough to defeat it. They let their dad think it's his fault. We don't even know what happened. We just found this on the road. Like, you sent Joseph to spy on us, and he died on the way there. This is your fault. If you wouldn't, you know what I mean?
In a phrase that is so tragic today, he died alone.
And his dad is there. I mean, we're not just talking about grieving a little bit. I mean, I'm going to go to the grave grieving over my lost son. And at no point, at least at this stage, is their guilt sufficient enough to say, "You know what, Dad, we're lying, we're so sorry, we told you that, let's go get him back from Egypt." I mean, they sit there and watch their father mourn the loss of his son, and they're okay with it.
Well, and the thing about it, and about that is, they don't know he's gone to Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
It says they're Ishmaelites, they're Midianites. They have no clue. They're out in the desert. There's no roads. It's not like they can follow the tracks. He's gone somewhere and they have no idea where he is.
Mm-hmm.
And so even if they told their father, it would be even worse, because now Daddy's going to wonder where is he and what's happening to him and what horrible things are going on, because, he's down there with them foreigners. Everybody knows about foreigners.
Yeah, that's right. He went south. We know what happens when people go south, right?
Well, okay, I hadn't thought about that. That'd be good.
Yeah. Verse 36. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard.
Mark that phrase too.
Absolutely.
Because that's going to be vital to understanding this story later on.
So here's Joseph, 17 years old. He's been the favorite son of his father's house. Let's notice his brothers are all out tending the flocks. They're all working. And what's Joseph doing? He's not out in the fields working. He's sitting at home with mom and dad.
Wearing his richly ornamented coat.
Right, wearing his fancy coat and not his work clothes. And dad says, "Hey, can you go out and see bring back a report of your brothers and tell me if they're working or not." If he would have been working with them, he wouldn't have been there to send out, right? So he's had a pretty good life up to this point, I think.
Oh, yeah. It's sort of the opposite, and this just occurred to me. It may have nothing to do with it, but you remember when Samuel came to select him as the king?
Yes.
Where was he? Well, he's out in the field. This is the opposite of that story.
Mm-hmm.
Joseph went from the house out into the field and bad things happened. David was already out in the field working, and when he came back in, good things happened.
Gets anointed. That's pretty good.
So,
that's a good point.
It's just, and like you said, he's at home, he doesn't have to work, and he's about to become a slave.
So, you think about, a lot of times we watch so many movies and things, we think in those dramatic kind of terms, and this is a dramatic story, let's be honest. I mean, there's a lot of emotion and things going on here. So let's imagine what it's like for someone who's had everything handed to them, basically his whole life for 17 years.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes from that, and his father, at his beck and call for whatever he needs, and now he is completely subject to the will of masters.
Yeah.
Now, whatever he's told to do, he's got to do it.
Or suffer the consequences.
That's right.
Because he's got two options here. One is he could be the spoiled kid, and he's going to get beaten, and maybe he's going to get killed. He's certainly not ever going to rise up high, because he'd be considered a worthless slave.
Mm-hmm.
And, with a spoiled kid, you kind of expect that's what's going to happen. But somewhere along the line, during that journey or whatever, Joseph decided if he was going to be a slave, he's going to be the best slave.
Mm-hmm.
And so he goes to work with a will. And it turns out good. Did he ever have to do that at home? No. And everything that Joseph is going to become is because he has now been taken out of that and made to go out into the real world.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's the key when you're going through difficult times, because the text doesn't give us this choosing, but it's there. He's 17, he gets sent into slavery. He's got choices he's got to make.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you can either point back and play the blame game or whatever else, or say, "I wish this hadn't happened," or "How come it happened?" You can ask all those questions, but it's not going to change the fact that you're in Potiphar's house. He's the master, you're the slave, right?
And again, it's like what we're seeing today. There are so many people that have blossomed in this. There's so many people that, what do you need? Let me help you. They're going around finding ways to say thank you to people. They're, everything. A lot of people are doing a lot of good with this. And then there's other people who just can't stop complaining and whining about it. That this is not fair and I've lost so much. Yeah, it all depends. What your circumstances are going to stay the same. The only variable is, what are you going to do about it?
And this becomes a real challenge even in the New Testament. With
yeah.
like Onesimus, what's a Christian to do as a slave? Am I supposed to flee from my master? Because I'm not supposed to have a master. I mean, this situation isn't right. Well, as a Christian, whatever state you're in, you live for God's glory in that state. If you're a slave, then you live as a slave to God's glory in that state. Seems to be kind of where Paul leads him.
That's the book of Philemon, if you want to go back and read it.
Correct.
And the one thing I've always wondered is, and this is just sort of, what would it have been like to have read the Gospel according to Judas? If he had, instead of just not being able to bear it, gone off and killed himself, what if he had repented, come back with the others, and gone to work for Jesus? Can you imagine the power of his story? Yeah, I'm the one who sold him. I'm the one who went up and kissed him. And he forgave me. You think he can't forgive you? Joseph could have gone down and just been a total brat.
Sure.
And nothing would have we'd never heard of him. But instead, he went and he allowed his circumstances, how he reacted to it was his reaction. And he became a better man as a slave than he ever was as a rich kid.
And I think that's the powerful point to anchor in, because what we remember about Joseph's whole story is kind of what comes in chapter 50 in verse 20, where it talks about you intended evil, but God used it for good. And that is powerful and it is important, but we have to remember Joseph is so many years removed from being 17 years old at that point. Now he's looking back and he's saying, in hindsight, I could see God's working. But when he was 17 in the back of a caravan with other slaves being brought down to Egypt to be sold off to whoever, that must have been a difficult time to have that faith and that confidence of, this is all God's working in good and all this. Later on, and we can talk about it in another session, but later on as we move through this story, his brothers recount hearing the distress of his soul, him screaming out and begging not for this to happen. Yeah. And so we have to be careful not to imagine that he's okay with it. He's just kind of the whole time he's like, oh, it's going to be fine. I'll be good. This doesn't matter. I mean, he does not want this to happen. Very much like Jesus in the garden, right? And saying if there's another way.
And, it made his emotional screaming and, was such that his brothers, decades later, still remembered, and as soon as something bad happened to them, they immediately said, this is because of what we did to Joseph. That this has eaten at them for a long, long time. And being a proponent of free will, even though God intended it for good, it was still up to Joseph to make it work.
That's right.
Because he could have messed this up if he had chosen not to be Joseph, but instead had been the rich kid. He could have messed that up.
And here's one of his statements of faith that he makes in the story, but he may not have been saying this at 17. God sent me here, not you. Yeah. He says, I want you to remember this. God sent me here, not you. So, again, at least 39, 40, 41 years old, he's looking back on all this and saying, this was God's doing, not just my brothers. God had a plan here of something that he was carrying out.
It's amazing how much we learn after we know everything.
Yeah. And so I think, like you said, in our situation right now today, as we look at the story of Joseph and we say, okay, well, what does this have to offer any of us? Hopefully I'm too old now for my siblings to sell me into slavery, and they wouldn't even get 20 pieces of silver.
Yeah, forget it.
I mean, but here's where I think the connection is. Joseph is subject to suffering that he has no control over. Yeah. It's just happening to him. And as it's happening to him, it's like you were just expounding on, he has a choice to make. This situation has happened to me. It's beyond my control. I can't change the situation, so I have to make a decision. Who am I going to be in the midst of this difficulty?
Yeah. And you know that Satan is pushing him.
Yes.
To not be Joseph. Go back to being the rich kid.
And he doesn't give up on that, by the way. Satan doesn't. Just because he sold him
And
to slavery.
it's going to keep going, because everything that happens up until the minute he stands before Pharaoh and says, this is what your dream means, everything is bad.
Mm-hmm.
Potiphar's wife, he gets this really great position, and because of lust, it's taken away from him. He gets a second chance. Maybe these guys will go back and tell somebody about me, and for 2 years, they forget.
Mm-hmm.
And so the pressure just keeps mounting on him. Instead of it easing up and it being easier, it just keeps getting tougher and tougher and tougher. And I can't help but go back to how often did he lay there thinking, what did those dreams mean?
Mm-hmm.
Because dreams are such an important part of this story.
And we see all that suffering, but one of the threads to look for as you read through Joseph's story, look at all the ways that God provides for Joseph, even in the midst of this hardship.
Yeah.
He doesn't get sold to just anybody. He gets sold to Potiphar. We're going to see what that means throughout the story. Key thing, and that's why we're telling you, highlight that part. Don't forget this piece of it because it's critical. But God provides as he's sold into slavery. God provides into prison. God provides. So even though, yes, there's hardship, and not a day of hardship. We're not talking about, oh, I suffered for an hour, now I'll be blessed my whole life. I mean, it's
Decades.
a life of challenges and struggles, and yet God's there alongside him the whole way.
And just when Joseph thinks, okay, now it's over and everything's good, boom.
It's like a reset button.
His past catches up to him.
Yeah.
And there's his brothers.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what do you do?
Mm-hmm.
Because if he'd have had them wiped out, nobody would have ever said a word.
Mm-hmm.
All he had to do was say the word. Now he's got the power, and they're metaphorically in the pit under his power, and he can have them sold into slavery. He can have them killed. He can do anything he wants, and nobody's going to say a word.
And you wonder if there's a reason God doesn't wait to bless Joseph in the way he did. If Joseph would have gotten that power at 18,
Mm-hmm.
something tells me his brothers wouldn't have lived long enough to really
No,
have much happen.
there'd have been a war party going out somewhere.
So, I mean, and I think all of that's significant. Joseph's, one of the things Carlos was saying this past week, one of his elders shared with him, was talking about this idea that God has to develop our character enough to be able to bless us.
Yeah.
Because we're not ready. We couldn't handle it.
You have to grow into your blessings.
That's right. Absolutely. And I think we kind of see that happening. God has such big things in store for Joseph, but he's got to lead him to it. Same way he does with Moses, right? You're going to be this leader of my people, but you got to spend some time on your own in the wilderness first before you're ready to lead my people out.
I think most everybody has that experience that, man, I wish I could go back and do that again because I would appreciate it so much more now. I think about school, Freed Hardeman and Harding. I wish I'd put a lot more time into my studies, and I wish I'd kept up on my Greek, and I wish this. Sometimes you can get blessings too early and you just don't appreciate them. And so now here I am at 65 and I'm going back and starting my serious reading again.
Yes. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of great connections to modern day to us when we look at Joseph, because I think we're in the same boat right now. We're living in the midst of a challenging time. It's beyond you and I can't change what's going on in the world right now. We can't snap our fingers and fix the situation. It's just beyond our control. But what we do have a choice, and we were talking about free will, we get to choose, who am I going to be in the midst of this difficult time?
And someday when we look back at this, it's always going to be a tragic time. But I wonder if somewhere in the future we won't look back at this and think, that's where a lot of people changed. Maybe instead of just going back to the old way, we're going to keep the thank you and appreciation and try to help other people that have come out of this. And if so, we'll all be better for it.
And I think I know God can use it for his good. The question is, will I be a part of using it to be a blessing?
Yeah.
And
it reminds us that you always have to be ready for the worst.
So when we pick up next week, we'll
in
jump
chapter 39.
In chapter 39, because we're not trying to skip any hard verses or anything like that, but we're trying to stay locked in on Joseph.
This is the story of Joseph. That's Judah and Tamar.
Right.
In 38. We know it's there. We're just not going to deal with it right now.
That's right. Because that would add another 6 months to our study.
At least.
So we're going to pick up in 39 with Joseph being in Potiphar's house. And again, the idea being Joseph's challenges are just beginning. at 17 years old being sold into slavery. His hardship journey with God is not over yet.
Remember, no good deed ever goes unpunished.
Yeah. And we'll see more of his family dynamic playing out, and certainly continue to see God's taking care of Joseph throughout this whole situation. Any other closing thoughts?
Just, we enjoy this. I hope you enjoy this. I hope it's useful to you. Stay isolated. Let's stay smart. Let's get through this thing so we can go back to meeting on Sundays together, not virtually.
Amen. And God bless you this week. And we encourage you, go ahead. We encourage cheating. Read 39 ahead of time. That's fine. Get into the story of Joseph. Look at the things that stand out to you. And next week we'll pick up in 39. I think there's going to be a lot of great things to share from there.
Thank you.